It coils, it waits, and it strikes only when it senses a threat to its dominance. So when the world's oldest civilization begins to awaken from centuries of silence, when its intellect sharpens and its economy rises like a blade in the dark, the empire across the ocean begins to shiver beneath its polished smile, because fear wears the mask of friendship, and hate the cloak of strategy. They fear a self-reliant giant they can't manipulate. Empires don't hate noise, they hate silence that builds strength. The United States has always preferred allies that depend on it, nations that lean on its economy, mimic its policies, and dance to the rhythm of its narrative. But India, ancient, proud, and increasingly self-sufficient, refuses to bow, refuses to imitate, refuses to play the role written for it by Western hands. This is not mere economic rivalry. This is deeper, psychological, strategic. They see a nation that once slept under colonial chains now awakening with fierce clarity. India does not ask permission to rise, it does not seek validation to grow, and in that it becomes unpredictable, unshaped by the usual pressures, untouched by the usual controls. The West has long built its dominance not just through warfare, but through the art of soft control, of loans dressed as gifts, of media cloaked in concern, of alliances poisoned with conditions. But what happens when a nation looks those deals in the eye and says, no? It terrifies them, because a self-reliant India is not just another country climbing up the ladder. It's a threat to the very architecture of influence they've spent decades constructing. A rising India means a market they can't easily flood, a government they can't easily bribe, a population they can't easily divide. The tools that worked elsewhere won't work here. That's why the tone changes. That's why the praise is faint and the criticism loud. That's why every step forward is met with suspicion, every move toward independence labeled as aggression. India's ambition is no secret, it lies in plain sight. But what makes it dangerous in their eyes is that it's no longer begging for approval. It's investing in itself, it's building technology, defending its borders, setting terms in trade, creating alternatives in diplomacy. The moment you don't need them, they begin to hate you, because in a world ruled by influence, dependence is currency. If they cannot own your decisions, they'll try to own your image, they'll call you unstable when you're strong. Nationalist when you're proud, aggressive when you're assertive. It's the oldest trick in the book, demonize what you can't dominate. But India's strength is not rooted in imitation. It's rooted in memory, memory of being ruled and memory of breaking free. So, while the West plays its usual games of setting fires and offering water, India builds in silence. It does not scream its victories, it secures them. It does not advertise its plans, it executes them. And that is where the fear truly begins. Because when you cannot predict someone, you cannot control them. The U.S. hates that India's rise is not a mirror of its own. India does not wear the Western face, does not carry their ideals like gospel, does not swallow their culture like medicine. It charts a different course, one that's older than America itself, and in doing so it threatens not just their power, but their myth of superiority. Understand this, their hatred is not personal, it's tactical. If India was still asking for crumbs, it would be celebrated. If it still begged for recognition, it would be applauded, but it isn't, and so now it must be managed, and if it can't be managed, it must be feared. But here lies the truth they refuse to accept. India doesn't need validation. It doesn't want a seat at their table. It's building its own. And that's what they truly hate. They hate what they cannot culturally dominate. Control begins not with chains, but with narratives. Conquest today doesn't march in boots. It walks in the form of entertainment, language, ideology, and identity. The United States has mastered this. Its greatest export is not technology or weapons, it is culture. It is the subtle but powerful art of rewriting minds, of making others believe that their own ways are outdated, that their own voices are irrelevant unless they speak with an American accent. This is how they dominate, not by destroying who you are, but by convincing you that who you are is not enough. And this is why India stands in their way. India, with its unapologetic chaos, its endless gods, its thousands of languages, its ancient scriptures, and its modern contradictions, does not bend easily. It does not erase its soul to fit into someone else's image. It does not rush to trade its identity for acceptance. And that defiance enraged the empire that needs the world to kneel, not in body, but in mind. When they look at India, they see something too complex to simplify, too spiritual to secularize, too ancient to modernize in the Western sense. They cannot reduce India to a stereotype and then sell it back to the world like they've done with so many others. Because India refuses to be flattened. Its culture isn't content to be a costume at a music festival or a trend on a streaming platform. It lives, breathes, resists, and in the art of cultural dominance, that is a fatal flaw. You see, the Western model only thrives when others copy it. They want your cities to look like theirs, your universities to teach what they believe, your children to dream in their language. The moment you resist, the moment you tell your own stories, build your own platforms, value your own philosophies, you become a problem. You become undemocratic, regressive, dangerous, not because you are any of those things, but because you've become immune to their influence. India's strength lies in its refusal to be absorbed. It listens to the West, but it doesn't worship it. It takes what's useful and discards the rest, and nothing is more threatening to cultural colonizers than a nation that thinks for itself. Because it sets a precedent, it shows others that there is a way out, that you can rise without selling your soul. That's why there's discomfort in their admiration. They praise your economy but critique your values. They applaud your growth but mock your traditions. They invite you to global stages only to lecture you once you arrive. It's not an accident, it's a tactic. Because as long as you doubt yourself, they retain power. But when you own your difference, you steal their weapon. India doesn't just protect its culture, it multiplies it through cinema that doesn't need Hollywood, through literature that doesn't need their approval, through festivals, languages, and customs that don't apologize for being loud, strange, or sacred. And in that assertion there is revolution. Remember, dominance isn't about war anymore. It's about shaping the way the world sees you and the way you see yourself. And that's where India breaks the pattern. It doesn't wait to be told who it is, it remembers, and what is remembered cannot be erased. So yes, they hate what they cannot dominate, not because it threatens their existence, but because it threatens their illusion. India, in all its complexity, proves that progress does not have to come at the cost of heritage, that modern power can rise from ancient soil, that strength doesn't have to wear their clothes, speak their tongue, or mirror their morality, and that is unforgivable. The silent rise is more dangerous than loud power. What they fear is not the one who shouts, but the one who watches, plans, and builds in silence. The world is accustomed to loud revolutions, to nations that announce their power with dramatic displays, to threats that scream before they strike. These are easy to spot, easy to control, easy to neutralize, but India is different. India does not roar, it grows. While the West stares at headlines, India moves behind them. It does not announce its victories before they are won. It does not demand recognition before it deserves it, and that restraint, that strategic patience, makes them uneasy. Because you cannot fight what you cannot predict. You cannot contain what you cannot see coming. The United States is used to dealing with extremes. With enemies that challenge it directly, with allies that submit completely, but India is neither. It is not loud enough to be an obvious threat, nor submissive enough to be controlled. It operates in the space between independent, focused, unshaken, and that makes it dangerous in a way that most of the world has forgotten how to be. India is mastering the one thing empires fear most, time. While others burn out chasing attention, India plays the long game. It does not trade its future for short-term applause. It builds infrastructure while the cameras point elsewhere. It crafts policy while the world sleeps. It forges alliances not from desperation, but from strategy. And by the time the world realizes what it has become, it will already be too late to stop it. The rise of India is not a spectacle. It is a process. Every space it enters, it reshapes. Every system it joins, it questions. And every deal it signs on its own terms. There is no panic in its pace, only precision, no noise in its progress, only momentum, and when a nation grows like that, it becomes more than powerful. It becomes untouchable. This is why the West grows nervous, because they cannot understand growth without aggression. They cannot comprehend ambition without arrogance. They cannot grasp how a nation that speaks softly can still command the room. They are so used to controlling others through attention, through the seduction of being seen, that they don't know how to handle someone who rises without needing their spotlight. India's rise isn't loud because it doesn't need to be. It does not need to remind the world of its capabilities. It lets its results speak. In the realm of technology, defense, space, diplomacy, and economy, India is not playing catch-up. It's playing a different game altogether, one rooted in self-respect, not comparison. They expected India to shout when it grew. They expected it to seek applause, to beg for validation. But instead, India chose something more terrifying, focus, and in that focus lies the real power. Because when you do not crave their attention, you become immune to their manipulation. A nation that does not rely on global approval is a nation they cannot control. A nation that refuses to announce its every step is one they cannot block. India has become that kind of nation, quiet, consistent, unwavering, and the silence that is what truly haunts them. Because they know how to fight noise, but they don't know how to stop a shadow. Control demands a submissive narrative. Understand this, the most effective form of power is not physical, it's psychological. The empire doesn't need to conquer your land if it can conquer your story. If it can write your past, define your present, and predict your future, then it owns you without lifting a weapon. That is how the United States operates, not through brute force, but through narrative supremacy, through the power of story, shaping how the world sees you, and more importantly, how you see yourself. They hate India because India refuses to be scripted. The global order is designed around a set of assumptions. Who is the hero? Who is the villain? Who is civilized? Who is backward? Who speaks sense? And who must be taught? These roles are assigned, not earned, and they are never meant to be changed. The United States, for all its calls for freedom, has spent decades enforcing this unspoken hierarchy. In it, the West leads, the East follows, they create, others consume, they define morality, others comply. And any nation that questions this balance threatens the structure itself. India, in its rise, is not just demanding power. It is reclaiming narrative. It is asking questions they don't want asked. Why must progress look Western? Why must development mean abandoning tradition? Why must a nation's success be measured only by how closely it resembles America? These are dangerous questions because once asked, they don't go away. The moment a country like India, with its size, its intellect, its heritage, begins to write its own story, the old stories fall apart. The myth of Western superiority begins to crack. The illusion that power must always wear a Western face starts to dissolve. That is what truly unsettles them, not India's missiles, not its markets, but its mind, a mind that remembers, a mind that resists being rewritten. For too long, the West has told India who it is, through textbooks, media, foreign analysts, and curated headlines. India was always either a mystical land or a chaotic mess, a spiritual relic or a developing burden. Always colorful, but never credible. That's how they kept it in check, not with sanctions, but with shame. They planted doubt in India's identity, and shame, once internalized, is more effective than any army. But that spell is breaking, slowly, deliberately. India is no longer listening to the voice outside telling it who to be. It's listening inward to its own memory, its own values, its own rhythm. And in that defiance lies a revolution. Because a nation that controls its own narrative becomes ungovernable by external hands. This is why the pressure grows. The headlines become harsher, the commentary more hostile, not because India is doing worse, but because it is thinking differently. It is acting without asking. It is defining success on its own terms, and that is unacceptable to those who rely on ideological obedience. They call it nationalism. They call it extremism. But those are just words thrown at anything that doesn't kneel. Because control demands your story to end with their victory. When it doesn't, they panic. India is not just writing a new chapter. It's burning the old book, and in its place, it's building a version of itself that cannot be dismissed, cannot be tokenized, cannot be reduced to someone else's metaphor. It is not East trying to be West. It is India being India, complex, confident, unapologetic. And when you no longer need their permission to be yourself, you become the one thing they cannot defeat. You become untouchable.
Spiritual strength undermines material control. The West is built on control of resources, of information, of systems. But more than anything, it thrives on controlling the desires of others. It sells a dream wrapped in consumption, that happiness lies in ownership, that freedom lies in indulgence, that meaning is found only in what can be touched, bought, or displayed. It's a model of power dependent on emptiness, on making you feel that something is always missing and that they alone can provide it. But what happens when you face a civilization that has spent thousands of years mastering the art of inner fulfillment? India is not just a political force, it is a spiritual one. That is what they cannot understand, and what they cannot understand they fear. Because spiritual strength creates independence from the very things the West uses to rule. You cannot manipulate a man who does not crave your approval. You cannot seduce a nation that does not envy your lifestyle. You cannot conquer a people who already know peace, not from what they own, but from what they are. This is India's most dangerous power, not its economy, not its army, not its technology, but its memory of the soul. A memory that runs deeper than any empire, older than any border, and more resilient than any ideology imported from across the seas. It is a nation that, for all its modern ambitions, still sits in temples, still lights lamps in prayer, still chants verses that predate every Western doctrine. And that continuity, that refusal to sever itself from the source, makes it ungovernable in the way the West prefers. Spirituality is not weakness, it is armor, because a people who are spiritually rooted are far harder to disorient. They do not crumble under psychological warfare. They do not collapse under moral confusion. They can modernize without westernizing. They can compete globally without abandoning who they are. but that terrifies the empire built on material leverage. Because when you look at the world through spiritual eyes, the glamour of their dominance begins to dim. Their towers look hollow, their riches look restless, their entertainment feels loud but empty, and their moral lectures begin to ring with hypocrisy. They offer freedom, but it is laced with anxiety. They offer choice, but it comes with chains. What they fear is that others will see through it, that India, by holding onto its inner foundation, is building a new model of power, one that balances growth with rootedness, ambition with stillness, intellect with humility. That model is not supposed to exist. The West survives by exporting desire and calling it culture. But India offers something that cannot be sold: dharma, balance, stillness. That is not a threat to their weapons, but it is a threat to their influence. And in this age, influence is everything. That is why they attack the culture, not just the policy. They mock the rituals, they question the customs, they paint spirituality as superstition, because if they can break your connection to the sacred, they can replace it with craving. If they can mock your inner world, they can sell you theirs. But India, stubborn and unshaken, keeps praying, keeps remembering, keeps rising. And the world watches a strange thing unfold: a country modernizing without losing its soul, becoming powerful without becoming hollow, competing without copying. This is the real revolution, not in steel or in code, but in spirit. The day a nation finds power within, it becomes immune to the games played outside. And that's what they fear, not your army, not your politics, but your peace, the kind of peace that cannot be bought, cannot be stolen, and cannot be broken. That peace is power, and they have no defense against it. India aligns without obeying, and that is the ultimate offense. In a world carved up by alliances and camps, obedience has become the currency of acceptance. You don't simply partner with a superpower, you submit. You don't just sign treaties, you absorb ideologies. That's the expectation, the unspoken rule. If you want a seat at the table, you nod when they speak, echo what they believe, and never question the hand that invites you. But India doesn't play that game. It forms alliances but refuses alignment of the mind. It walks alongside the West when interests align, but never forgets its own footing. That defiance, that calm refusal to surrender sovereignty of thought, is what ignites their discomfort. Because India has learned the dance of global diplomacy, but it dances to its own music, and that makes them furious. They want dependents, not equals. They want grateful juniors, not self-respecting partners. They have no issue with India being strong, as long as that strength is borrowed from their institutions, their systems, their approval. But India's strength is increasingly self-sourced, and worse, it's selective. It says yes when it makes sense, no when it doesn't. It supports the West in some causes and remains silent in others. That neutrality, that refusal to blindly choose sides, is mistaken as arrogance. But it's not arrogance, it's strategy. India has tasted colonization. It knows what it means to lose agency, and it has vowed never to lose it again, not even in the soft form of ideological dependence. It remembers too clearly what it costs to follow someone else's idea of right, just, or developed, so it weighs every step with precision. It does not jump at every Western cause. It does not echo every Western condemnation. It listens, but it decides for itself. And in the modern world, that kind of autonomy is rare. That's why you see sudden critiques, harsh reports, shifting tones in diplomatic circles. It's not always about what India has done, it's often about what India refuses to do. It refuses to isolate its historical allies on command. It refuses to parrot the convenient morality of the moment. It refuses to compromise long-term interests for short-term applause. That level of discernment makes it unreliable not in strength, but in subservience. They don't hate India because it is chaotic. They hate it because it is clear about its vision, clear about its red lines, clear that its foreign policy is not for sale, not for headlines, not for praise, not even for partnership. And when a nation that big, that ancient, that resourceful acts with that kind of clarity, it becomes a model. Others begin to watch. Others begin to think, maybe we don't need to obey either. That ripple effect is dangerous. Because if one nation can rise while staying true to its own path, what stops another from doing the same? The architecture of control begins to wobble. The illusion that power only comes through obedience begins to collapse. India's independent diplomacy is not just a rejection of control. It's a demonstration of an alternative, one that scares those who have relied for decades on being the world's ideological compass. They call it stubbornness. They call it unpredictability, but those are just euphemisms for something simpler. India cannot be made to kneel. Not by bombs, not by dollars, not by opinions wrapped in friendship. It will walk with you, but never behind you. That is the insult. That is the wound they can't heal, because they are not used to partners with pride. They are used to power structures. And when a partner brings both strength and independence to the table, it doesn't just threaten their influence, it challenges their identity. And they cannot bear to be challenged, not by the very nation they once expected to follow, so they mask their discomfort as criticism. They call sovereignty provocation. They call self-respect nationalism. But behind the smoke, the truth is simple. India is not theirs to manage. It never was.